When the cameras first captured the scene, many assumed it would be just another clash, the kind of televised back and forth that Donald Trump had mastered. He had always been a figure who thrived on control of the room, control of the narrative, and above all, control of his own voice. His speeches, rallies, and interviews had shaped him into a presence that could rarely be ignored. Whether one agreed with him or not, his ability to command attention through words had always been his sharpest weapon. But in that single moment on live television, the illusion of control cracked in front of millions, and the world saw what Trump had never allowed to be seen before: silence that he could not escape. It happened so suddenly that even the moderators hesitated, unsure whether to cut to a break or allow the awkward pause to stretch. Obama had just delivered a cutting response, a factual dismantling of Trump's claims, delivered with the calm assurance that had become his trademark. Normally, Trump would have fired back instantly, filling the air with his energy, his interruptions, and his sharp retorts. Instead, his mouth opened, but no words emerged. The seconds ticked by, each one louder than the last, and with them, the perception of his dominance began to fade. The collapse of control was not just about the inability to speak, it was about the unraveling of a persona built entirely on the ability to always have the last word. For a man like Trump, who had always projected unshakable confidence, the silence became more powerful than any insult ever hurled his way. Viewers who had tuned in, expecting to see him overwhelm his opponent, now found themselves staring at someone visibly struggling against an invisible barrier. His face carried frustration, his gestures betrayed agitation, but his voice, the foundation of his presence, remained locked away. The audience in the studio shifted in their seats, whispering, exchanging glances, sensing that something historic was happening before their eyes. Control is a fragile thing, especially when one's entire public image depends on it. Trump had cultivated the art of appearing unbreakable, the man who could talk over anyone, who could spin any situation into his favor by sheer force of words. To lose that ability, and to do so in front of Barack Obama, his most public rival, made the loss even more profound. It wasn't just silence, it was defeat in the most symbolic form. He had not been cut off by a moderator, not silenced by protesters, not drowned out by crowd noise. His own voice had simply abandoned him at the precise moment he needed it. The collapse of control extended beyond the stage. Social media erupted instantly, with clips circulating of the silence stretched against Obama's firm delivery. Commentators didn't need to embellish what had happened. The raw footage told the entire story. Analysts spoke about the irony of a man known for dominating every microphone losing his voice when it mattered most. His supporters scrambled to explain it away as a momentary lapse or a medical issue, while his critics framed it as poetic justice. But no matter how one viewed it, the loss of control was undeniable. In many ways. The silence revealed more about Trump than words ever could. It showed vulnerability, a side he had worked tirelessly to conceal. For years, his strategy had been to never let silence linger, to fill every gap with his voice, to never give space for doubt or weakness. Yet here, under the sharp gaze of Obama and the eyes of millions, silence became unavoidable. The man who had built a reputation on speaking loudly and often now faced the harsh reality of having nothing to say or being unable to say it. The collapse of control also exposed how quickly perception can shift. A leader who thrives on constant expression cannot afford even a moment of wordlessness, because that moment becomes magnified. It wasn't just about losing his voice, it was about losing the dominance he had always wielded through his voice. In the span of a few seconds, Trump went from commanding figure to a man isolated by his own silence. The weight of that shift was palpable, and the longer it lasted, the more it eroded the image he had built over decades. For those watching, it became a reminder of how fragile authority can be when it relies on performance. The collapse was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost eerie, and yet it echoed far louder than any of his speeches ever had. In those silent moments, people saw not just a lapse, but a turning point, proof that even the strongest image can fracture when the element of control slips away. Barack Obama's ability to command an audience has always been rooted in his calm precision. He never rushed, never raised his voice unnecessarily, and never relied on spectacle to make his points resonate. On that night, as he stood across from Donald Trump under the harsh glow of studio lights, this composure became his greatest weapon. While Trump wrestled with silence, Obama filled the room with the steady rhythm of words that carried both weight and clarity. The contrast between the two men could not have been sharper. One was muted by an inexplicable loss of voice, while the other used his voice with surgical exactness. Obama began by addressing policy, laying out statistics and historical context, with the ease of someone deeply familiar with his material. Each fact rolled off his tongue without hesitation, creating a narrative that was difficult to dispute. Normally, Trump would have challenged him aggressively, interrupting and reframing the conversation to tilt it in his favor. But on this night, with his responses trapped inside him, Trump's silence became the backdrop against which Obama's dominance was amplified. Viewers could see the imbalance grow with every passing minute. the power dynamic shifting steadily in Obama's direction. Asterisk. The moment wasn't about theatrics, it was about substance delivered in a way that demanded attention. Obama's tone was measured, his words carefully chosen, as though he understood the significance of what was happening in real time. He spoke as though addressing not just the moderators or the live audience, but the millions at home who were watching every second. His confidence wasn't forced. It was natural, built on preparation and experience. Against this, Trump's silence seemed even heavier, almost as if it were an admission of defeat without a word being spoken. Asterisk. For years, Trump had used his voice to bulldoze opponents, creating chaos that left little room for calm rebuttals. This time, however, there was no bulldozing. Obama's dominance came from the fact that he didn't need to raise his voice to win the exchange. His calm made the silence across the stage more uncomfortable, more glaring. People watching could sense that Trump was cornered, not by aggression, but by the sheer steadiness of a man who knew how to use words to build authority. Asterisk. The symbolic weight of the moment was immense. Obama, who had often been targeted by Trump's rhetoric, now stood in a position where his words were not just heard, but uncontested. He delivered his arguments one after another, almost as though he were lecturing on history, governance, and responsibility, while Trump stood as a silent figure, unable to mount a defense. The image was powerful, one man holding the stage with his voice, the other stripped of his most essential tool. Asterisk. Obama's dominance wasn't only about what he said, but how he said it. His cadence gave the impression of control, of assurance, that could not be shaken. He didn't need to mock or gloat, his words alone carried enough authority. This, in many ways, intensified the effect. Trump had long relied on combative energy, turning confrontations into spectacles that often distracted from the content. But when faced with Obama's steady delivery, that strategy became useless. Without the ability to speak, Trump was reduced to expressions of frustration, his body language speaking volumes about the frustration of being overshadowed. Asterisk. What viewers witnessed was more than a debate exchange. It was a moment of symbolic victory. Obama, with his unbroken stream of reasoned points, projected leadership in its purest form. The situation highlighted the importance of clarity, the value of measured speech in a world often dominated by noise. For Trump, the silence stripped him of his usual dominance, making him appear smaller against the backdrop of Obama's commanding presence. Asterisk. As the night wore on, the gap between the two only widened. Obama's voice became the soundtrack of the event, filling the airwaves while Trump's silence lingered like an absence impossible to ignore. Commentators later noted that it wasn't just what Obama said, but the fact that he said it while Trump couldn't, that left such a lasting impression. The image of calm, composed authority, standing in contrast to frustrated silence, etched itself into the memory of everyone who watched. Asterisk. By the time the broadcast ended, Obama's dominance was undeniable. He had not shouted, he had not needed theatrics. He had simply spoken, and in doing so, he demonstrated that sometimes power lies not in the volume of one's voice, but in the steadiness of it. His words filled the void Trump could not, and in that void, the balance of power shifted completely. The silence that fell upon Donald Trump during that live broadcast became more than a momentary lapse. It transformed into a symbol that people across the country struggled to stop talking about. For a man whose very identity was built on repetitive, commanding words, the sudden absence of his voice was unsettling. But the deeper shock came from what that silence represented. It wasn't just a failure to respond in real time. It was a collapse of the image he had carefully curated, an unraveling of the very essence of how he projected power. The symbolism of silence weighed far more heavily than any words that could have been spoken that night. Asterisk. Trump had always used speech as both shield and weapon. He controlled rooms by dominating conversations, speaking over others, and setting the rhythm of exchanges so that his opponents were forced to react. His voice wasn't just communication, it was strategy, a tool for asserting dominance. Yet, at that crucial moment, the silence made it appear as though he had no strategy, no shield, and no way to fight back. For viewers, the sight of Trump standing speechless while Barack Obama delivered point after point felt almost surreal. The man who had once prided himself on never backing down now looked trapped, not by his opponent, but by his own muteness. The symbolism became clear within minutes as social media feeds exploded. Memes, captions, and clips captured the irony. Trump, who had spent years belittling rivals with words, rendered voiceless in front of the one rival who had long defined him politically. The silence didn't just feel like an absence, it felt like a message, as though the universe itself had intervened to mute him at the very moment when he needed his voice the most. For his critics, it became a moment of poetic justice. For his supporters, a troubling image they struggled to explain away. Asterisk. Obama's steady voice filled the space that Trump's silence left behind, magnifying the symbolism even more. Every sentence Obama spoke seemed to echo louder simply because no response came back. Each pause between Obama's statements became another reminder of the words that weren't coming from across the stage. The symbolism was layered, one man calm and articulate, shaping the narrative with clarity, while the other, long known for dominating through verbal force, stood powerless without his greatest asset. Asterisk, what made the silence so powerful was its contrast to Trump's history. He had always thrived on confrontation, on creating soundbites that sparked outrage and loyalty in equal measure. He rarely allowed a moment of pause, always quick to fill gaps with slogans, accusations, or self-praise. That night, however, the pause wasn't his choice. It was imposed on him. The silence wasn't a tactic, it was a failure. And because it unfolded in real time, unedited, in front of millions, the symbolism grew larger than the event itself. Asterisk, people began to interpret it in countless ways. Some saw it as the weight of truth finally catching up to him, as though Obama's words had struck so deeply that Trump literally had no reply. Others speculated about his health, suggesting something physical might have caused the silence. But regardless of theories, the imagery remained the same. Trump, a man defined by constant talking, silenced in the moment where talking mattered most. The symbolism was impossible to separate from the man himself. Asterisk, for many, the silence became emblematic of a larger story that without the noise, without the relentless barrage of words, Trump's presence diminished. His voice had always been his armor, deflecting criticism, rallying crowds, overwhelming interviewers, but stripped of it, what remained was a figure who looked almost ordinary, unable to stop the tide of another's words. In contrast, Obama's steady delivery felt like a reminder of how leadership can be conveyed, not through volume, but through clarity. The symbolism of one man muted while the other spoke with conviction turned into a defining image. Asterisk, the power of silence is that it invites interpretation, and this silence in particular invited a tidal wave of it. News outlets replayed the clip endlessly, headlines framing it as a collapse, a breakdown, a turning point. Analysts emphasized that sometimes silence says more than words ever could, and in this case, the silence said everything. It said vulnerability, it said defeat, it said the collapse of a carefully maintained image of dominance. And because it was Trump, a man whose entire persona relied on being heard, the symbolism struck even deeper. Asterisk, by the time the night ended, the silence had already cemented itself in memory. It became shorthand for weakness, a moment that opponents would reference again and again. Trump, who had always used words to bend perception, found himself defined by the absence of them. And for millions of viewers, that silence became more than an awkward pause. It became a symbol of what happens when the voice that built a persona suddenly disappears. When the broadcast ended, the silence that had surrounded Donald Trump did not fade away. It lingered, rippling across households, newsrooms, and social media platforms. People who had tuned in, expecting a fiery clash, walked away stunned, replaying the same few seconds where his lips moved but no words came. Within minutes, clips of the moment flooded online feeds, spreading faster than any scripted line or carefully staged soundbite ever could. What the audience had just witnessed was not simply a debate gone wrong, it was a public unraveling, and the speculation surrounding it took on a life of its own. Asterisk, television analysts scrambled to make sense of what had happened. Some questioned whether it was a medical issue, pointing to the suddenness of his silence and the frustration etched across his face. Others suggested psychological pressure, arguing that Barack Obama's relentless precision had finally cornered him in a way no one else ever had. But whatever the reason, the effect was undeniable. Millions of Americans were left with the indelible image of Trump unable to speak in the very arena where his voice had always been his strongest weapon. Asterisk, the public reaction was immediate and polarized. His supporters rushed online to defend him, insisting it was a temporary issue that meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. They framed it as a human moment, something that could happen to anyone under pressure. Yet even as they tried to spin it, the footage itself undermined their efforts. For years, Trump had cultivated the image of being untouchable, the man who always had a comeback, always had a slogan, always had a way to dominate the exchange. To see him stripped of that was shocking, and no amount of excuses could erase the memory of that silence. Asterisk, for his critics, the silence was embraced as symbolic, almost poetic. They described it as the ultimate undoing, a moment where his endless stream of words had finally run dry. Jokes spread quickly online, memes comparing the silence to a long-awaited pause button on years of unrelenting rhetoric. Hashtags trended. Late-night shows opened with clips of the broadcast, and political commentators spoke of it as a turning point. The silence was replayed not just as an awkward moment, but as a defining one. Asterisk, what made the moment even more powerful was Obama's presence on the other side of the stage. His voice had not wavered, his delivery had not faltered, and his arguments had continued to flow without obstruction. The visual of one man speaking steadily while the other stood voiceless only amplified the impact. It wasn't just that Trump was silent, it was that Obama was not. The contrast gave the moment a sharp edge, one that would be dissected endlessly in the days and weeks that followed. Asterisk, speculation soon expanded beyond the event itself. Some wondered what it meant for Trump's political future. If his voice, his greatest tool, could betray him once, could it happen again? Was this a one-time lapse, or the start of something larger? Every question seemed to circle back to The same haunting image of his lips moving without sound. Even those who dismissed the event as overblown could not deny the way it captured the nation's attention. Asterisk, the shockwaves reached into every corner of media. Editorials were written about the fragility of public image, about how quickly a reputation built on dominance could collapse under the weight of a single moment. Analysts debated whether this silence would harden his base or weaken it. Psychologists were brought on air to explain the effects of stress and confrontation on the human body. The speculation, in many ways, became bigger than the event itself. Asterisk, but beneath all the chatter, what stood out most was the rawness of what people had seen. It was not a scandal revealed through documents, not a gaffe spun by headlines. It was something caught live, undeniable, impossible to edit out. The shock was in its authenticity, in the fact that it unfolded in real time with no chance of correction. That authenticity is what made it stick. Asterisk for Trump. The silence was more than a lapse, it was a reminder of how quickly perception can shift. For years, he had relied on words to shape reality, bending narratives to his will. But when the words vanished, the reality that remained was one he could not control. And for the public, that reality was as shocking as it was unforgettable. As the dust settled from that unforgettable night, the silence continued to echo long after the cameras had stopped rolling. People didn't just remember the arguments, the facts, or even Obama's steady delivery. They remembered the moment when Donald Trump opened his mouth and no sound came. That single lapse overshadowed everything else, becoming the clip replayed on endless loops, the image etched into memory. It was shocking, not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it was the opposite. Quiet, unexpected, and undeniably real. Asterisk, Trump had built his political brand on words. His voice was his engine, his shield, his constant tool of influence. He dominated news cycles not with policy papers or quiet persuasion, but with the force of his speech rallies filled with chants. Interviews packed with interruptions, tweets that carried across the world. For a man so reliant on constant expression, silence was not just absence, it was exposure. It revealed the fragility behind the facade, the vulnerability behind the confidence. That is why the public couldn't stop talking about it. Asterisk, Obama's presence only amplified the shock. He had been calm, precise, unwavering, filling the space with reason while his opponent faltered. The contrast was almost cinematic, as though crafted to symbolize a deeper truth. One man finding strength and composure, the other suddenly undone by the loss of his voice. The symbolism was not lost on anyone watching, and it became the narrative that defined the event. Asterisk, the aftermath showed just how much one moment can ripple through society. Supporters scrambled to explain, critics reveled in the irony, and commentators treated it as a shift in political storytelling. Yet beyond the chatter, what lingered was a sense of collective disbelief. The idea that Trump, so known for dominating conversations, could stand voiceless was almost too much to process. And because it had happened live, without editing or filters, it carried an authenticity that no spin could erase. Asterisk, moments like this remind us how fragile image and power truly are. A reputation can be built over years, reinforced through thousands of speeches and appearances, but it only takes seconds to unravel. For Trump, the silence was more than a pause. It was a fracture in the narrative he had spent so long constructing. For Obama, it was an unspoken victory he didn't need to gloat, because the silence did all the work. Asterisk, in the end, the night wasn't remembered for policy points or political strategies. It was remembered for the shock of seeing the unexpected, the man who had always relied on his voice suddenly, without it. That image became